Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. This episode takes us into the mysterious world of Joanne Harris, the author of the UK bestseller Chocolat. Discussing her latest work, A Narrow Door, a gripping whodunnit that explores the lengths a headmistress will go to protect her school's reputation. Joanne's writing often takes aim at difficult topics, and A Narrow Door is no exception. Originally recorded at Bradford Literature Festival 2022, this episode dives into the mind of this acclaimed author to explore the themes that make her work so compelling.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Bradford Literature Festival. Some of you will have heard me say this many times already today, but we do remind you to please turn your phones to silent or turn them off to avoid disruption. And if you'd like to tell us what you think, please do tweet and use the hashtag BradfordLitFest. Additionally, if anyone would like to be excluded from any of our photography, please do let us know so we can provide you with one of our lanyards. And finally, if at any point you do feel like you need to take a moment, please feel free to step outside and come back in when you can. And without further ado, please welcome your host, Yvette Huddleston.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to see so many of you here, and I'm delighted to be here and to be doing this event with the wonderful Joanne Harris. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about Joanne. I'm sure you know quite a lot already. And then we'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from you. So put your thinking caps on and prepare for that one. So Joanne Harris is the best-selling author of over 20 novels across lots of different genres, including historical fiction, suspense, magic, realism, mythology and fantasy. She's also written short stories, novellas, 3 cookbooks, a musical, several screenplays and the libretti for 2 short operas. Her books have been published in more than 50 countries and she's won a number of UK and international awards. Her 1999 novel Chocolat became an international bestseller, and the book has sold over 1 million copies in the UK alone. And in the year 2000, it was made into an Oscar-nominated film starring Juliette Binoche. So Joanne was a teacher for 15 years, during which she wrote 3 novels, including Chocolat, and that's quite pertinent to the novel we'll be talking about today. Yeah. And Joanne's also been a judge for many literary prizes, the Orange Prize, for example, and the Betty Trask Award, and she's currently the chair of the Society of Authors. So today we're going to be talking about her latest novel, A Narrow Door, which is a psychological thriller, and it's the 3rd book in a series of novels set at St Oswald's Grammar School. And we'll be talking about that, obviously, and then other aspects of her long and very successful career. Your psychological thrillers have been very well received by and praised by sort of eminent figures in the genre like Val McDermott and Harlan Coben. And this book was described by one reviewer as irresistibly readable, dark and brilliant with a masterful emotional punch, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Yes, so the novel, it's the 3rd in a series, as I said, at St Oswald's Grammar School, which is in the fictional Yorkshire town of Mulberry.
Yeah, we pronounce it Morebury in the fictional town of Morebury, because it's the kind of place where nobody who doesn't live there can actually pronounce the name. And that tells you a little bit about the place. I live in a place called Almondbury, which the locals pronounce Ambry. It has nothing to do with Morebury, but it's not a million miles away.
So, like the previous 2 novels in this series, The Gentlemen and Players and Different Class, but it can be read as a standalone novel.
Yeah,
like
they're all standalone novels. They're just set in the same place, and some of the same characters tend to come back. So if you like the book and you want to expand the universe, then you can read the others. Otherwise, you can just take it as it is. It should be fine.
So let's talk about the school then. So it's a traditional boys' grammar school that's had seen quite a bit of scandal over the past few years and difficulty and things as detailed in the book. And it's just sort of on the cusp of a big change, isn't it? So it's 500 years old, and it's the first time they've ever had a female head in that time. And they're about to admit girls to the school, and then tell us that there's a strange discovery by a group of some of the students, isn't there, which kicks things off.
You know, of course, anybody who knew me from my previous life will know that I was a teacher in Leeds at a boys' school, a boys' grammar school, of venerable age in Leeds for quite some time. I think I was there for 15 years, and St Oswald's is not entirely dissimilar, let's put it that way. So St Oswald's is a school of some reputation, but it's had its ups and downs. It's not doing tremendously well financially, and it's been rocked by scandals. And last year, which was the events of different class, a crisis team moved in to hopefully pull this failing school back into its academic area again. And the head always leaves. For some reason in these books, the head never lasts very long. They're a bit like Defence Against the Dark Arts teachers. They don't last. This one has left, but one member of the crisis team has remained, who was one of the deputies. Her name is Rebecca Buckfast, and she is the other main character of this book. The returning character is called Roy Straightley, and he's a Latin master, perpetually on the verge of retirement. In Gentlemen and Players, he was just about to retire, but he didn't want to. Partly because he's very loyal to St Oswald's. He loves it, he loves the place, he loves his boys. He doesn't love the management. There are lots of things he doesn't love. He doesn't love email, or whiteboards, or men in suits, or the computer department, or the German department, or the third master. But otherwise, he's very, very fond of St Oswald's, and he has nothing to retire to. He has no family, he has no friends outside of his colleagues at St Oswald's. He's terribly afraid of retirement, and so you can tell that he's going to hang on for dear life. And every year, there is some new challenge for him to face, and this year it's the worst challenge of all. Women have entered the school. There is a headmistress. For the first time in 500 years, she has brought girls in with her. In fact, there were girls last year in the sixth form, but he didn't get to see many of them. Now they're everywhere. And all the things that girls bring with them, strange smells, yogurts, fruit, salad bowls, absolutely. And of course, new facilities too, new sports facilities, changing rooms, bathrooms, all kinds of things. And so poor old St Oswald's is being rocked by all these changes, and Roy Straightley particularly feels that now the school needs him more than ever. And on the first day of term, a group of his boys, his special squad of boys who he's known since they arrived at the school and who are now kind of 15 or 16, bring him the news that they found something on the site of one of these grand new buildings that the new head has planned. This is the site of a swimming pool, and they've seen something that they think might be human remains. So Straightley comes out to check on this, and then he tells the new head what he has seen. And the surprise is that actually she's not all that surprised.
Yes.
Not only does she know something about this, but she doesn't seem very enthusiastic in sharing with the police or with the authorities, and so she tells a story. This is a story within a story. She tells the story that Straightley needs to hear before they decide what to do. And the story gets more and more complicated and goes back in time, as a lot of my stories do, because these characters are very much...
Yes. So you've told us that, I mean, Roy Straightley is he's a very... you really warm to him because he's kind of... he's got this great sort of acerbic wit. I think you feel sympathy. Rebecca Buckfast, she's interesting because she's not an entirely sympathetic character, but as you get to know her, you're sort of definitely rooting for her, which I think is really... It's interesting the way you've done that.
Actually. Yeah. I love the way you say she's not an entirely unsympathetic character.
That understatement,
then. She's a terrible woman. She is absolutely terrible. She has done terrible things, but I kind of like her too. Roy Straightley is not perfect in any way at all, but I've enjoyed writing him and his voice, and I enjoy writing Buckfast's voice as well, even though she is clearly a bad woman who has done bad things.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a spoiler, really. She tells you herself on the first page.
Yes, she does tell you just how awful she is, actually, yes. So I can see the relish that you have there. So it was enjoyable to write that kind of character, I imagine.
It kind of was, particularly after spending 15 years at Leeds Grammar School.
But Buckfast also, she's a sort of unreliable narrator as well, isn't she? Which, again, is that quite satisfying? Because you're kind of playing with the reader's expectations all the time, isn't it?
Well, the thing is, no reliable narrator exists, because as soon as you write anything in the first person, you are seeing things from the point of view of the person talking to you. Nobody has exactly the same point of view as anybody else. So even if a narrator is trying really hard to be honest, they will not tell you everything. And my narrators are not always trying very hard to be honest. So they don't lie to you exactly, but they do lie to each other. And because this book has two narrators, one of them is Roy Straightley, the other one is Rebecca Buckfast, you, the reader, you get a bit of an overview because you see the things that they're not telling each other. So you get to know more than each of them informs the other about, but you still might not know everything because people's perspectives can be tricky.
Yes, and they withhold certain things, and yes.
Also, there is something wrong with Rebecca Buckfast. There's something wrong with her and her memory and her past and her upbringing, and it's at the heart of this story, and it is a kind of puzzle that you have to unwrap right to the centre before you really understand everything that's been going on.
Right, it's wonderfully complex, and yes, it's great. You're kind of excavating as you go along as you're reading it, which is brilliant. So you mentioned the dual narrative and that it's first-person narration, which is something you do quite a bit in your books, isn't it? So what is it? I mean, what's attractive about that device for you, and what does it allow you to do as a writer?
Well, I think that, I've been using multiple narrator narratives for 30 years now, so I've kind of got used to it, and I've got used to what it allows me to do as an author, because to me it's a little bit like different camera angles. You get different character angles on a story. So you can see characters from the inside, and then you can see them from the outside too. You can see how somebody else sees them, and you can see how they present themselves and how they see themselves. You can get their inner monologue. You can get the things they're thinking. You can look into their past. But you can also know the things that they don't know within the story. And so to me, it makes a lot of sense using multiple narrators, because otherwise you're limited to one single camera and what that camera sees. I'm using camera imagery because I'm just really visual in the way that I think about writing. But yeah, it just seems, and it's fun. It's nice to get to the heart of some of these characters and to see what makes them tick. And particularly villains, because otherwise villains tend to end up being quite unidimensional in novels. And I don't like that. I like actually to find out where that person got the thing that made them into a villain, because being a villain is not a standard life choice, and usually it's a line in the sand that you end up having to cross. And you've crossed it before you even know that it was there in the first place. And I like that moment of uncertainty in characters, which is why I so often write about their past.
So the two time frames, as you say, that's kind of exploring the past. So we've got 1989 and 2006. And as you say, you want to try and understand the villain. I mean, you explore some really, I don't want to give too much away, but, childhood trauma, for example, and the sort of effect that has in the long term. So with something like that, what did you do some research on that sort of thing, or was it something you decided you wanted to?
And I also taught in a school, and every school is a potential daily stage for tragedy and farce. And everywhere that I've taught, because I taught in other places and not just Leeds Grammar School, but everywhere seemed to have secrets and people that were hiding secrets and just things that happened, everyday dramas. And it was quite easy to pull out certain elements of that and to fictionalize them and to take characters and to fictionalize them too. And I mean, the reason I have to fictionalize all this stuff is that nobody would ever believe the truth. If I were to write an absolutely realistic book about being a teacher in a school, then nobody would believe it because it would be far too far-fetched. And so I tone everything down. But it's you know, like every community. I mean, I think one of the things you said that I wrote a lot of different genres, which is kind of true if you're a publisher and you're trying to fit things into boxes. But if you look at the overview of what I write, it's generally the same kind of narrative. It's the narrative of the community under pressure. And the smaller the community, the more volatile it can be when it's under pressure. And schools are amazing communities because basically what you've got in a school is a community of teachers, which more or less stay the same, but obviously there are newcomers, there are people who come and go, there are people who die, there are newbies who arrive. Every year there is a certain amount of change. And then you've got the pupils who come and go on a regular basis too. And you've got the core of old faithfuls who have been there forever and who have made friendships, and also the opposite of friendships. I find that staff rooms are filled with these lines that you cannot cross because at some point 20 years ago, Dr. So-and-so took all the green chalk without telling Dr. So-and-so, and there has been, let's say, a coldness between them ever since. And so it was quite easy, actually, to look at these relationships, which can sometimes be closer than family relationships, because when you teach in a school, you end up seeing a lot more of your colleagues and the people you teach than you do with your family. And so it was quite easy to kind of put those characters under pressure and to see what happened.
And do you think the psychological thriller genre, if we're talking a bit about genre, is suited particularly, or the school setting, that sort of fairly closeted environment, does that work particularly well?
Well, it kind of does, yes, because schools not only have a ready-made small community, which is always under pressure, because actually you never know as a teacher what's going to happen and what you're going to have to deal with, but you also have a community that has its own rules, its own infrastructure, its pyramid of authority that you have to defer to or not, in Straightley's case, and it exists independently of the outside world in a lot of ways. So there's that, and there's an interesting dynamic there when you're dealing with people who are within this community as opposed to outside of it, where the rules are a bit different and the authority structure is a bit different. And as soon as you write anything about characters and go deeply into characters, you realize what everybody is hiding. I've recently found out that there is a genre called dark academia. I didn't realize that this genre existed. In the same way that when I wrote Chocolat, I didn't realize that magic realism existed either, because I hadn't read any. But yeah,
confectionery-based magic realism.
I'm obviously not the only person who thinks that there is something essentially a bit spooky about schools, particularly when everybody isn't there, on the days when there are no pupils, or after home time when you are the one member of staff left still marking books, and all of a sudden the walls are full of weird noises. There's something there to look at, and so that was one of the things that entered this book, which is, it's not a supernatural exactly, but it has elements of the supernatural in it, simply because of the character who's telling the story. Rebecca Buckfast has got a ghost in her past. I think we don't need to worry too much about spoilers here, because it's one of her main character points. Rebecca Buckfast had a brother called Conrad, who was 10 years older than she was, and who, when he was 15, disappeared from school, and she was there. And not only has she no memory of exactly what happened, but her family and she have never really quite survived the loss of this boy, who nobody knows if he's alive or dead or what happened to him. But it obviously created a kind of gap where Rebecca Buckfast's childhood should have been, and where some of her childhood relationships could have been. And this is partly why she is the way she is, but it's also why she is a deeply haunted character who has spent much of her career trying to find out what happened to Conrad, and sort of trying to get her own back.
And that's where the kind of the sympathy for her comes in as well. You know, even though, as you say, she's a monster, we kind of feel for her, don't we?
Well, I do. I certainly do. I think you can have sympathy for anybody once you understand why they are the way they are. Because as soon as you start to scratch the surface of people, they become interesting, and they have things that have shaped them, and things that have dictated their behaviour. And you get to know the things that they care about or the things that they don't care about. And this is, to me, what makes an interesting character in a thriller. So this is why my thrillers are not so much quite about the external life of people, but very much about their internal life as well.
So there's so many themes in there, as you say, you know, the way we're shaped by our past, what we're prepared to do for personal gain, you know, why we behave in certain ways. There's also the sort of, and grief and loss as well, which is a huge part of it. But class is also a theme here, isn't it, as well? And throughout this series of books, you know, which seems to permeate every aspect of English life, but particularly education.
Well, yes. I mean, with a school like St Oswald's, which is a private fee-paying school, I set it at a time where I still understood the sort of school I'd taught in. I wouldn't set it in a school now because actually schools have moved on a bit. And because I left in the early 2000s, I have set these stories in the early 2000s. So there is a bit of a retro feel about it, although St Oswald's is a bit of a retro place anyway, much as the old Leeds Grammar School was a bit of a retro place. Full disclosure, my form room was in the bell tower. There were about 1,000 steps to walk up to the bell tower, and no, I didn't teach in my form room all the time, and so I was running up and down those steps all the time with piles of books and bander machines and overhead projectors and all the other garbage that you needed when you were a school teacher at that time. And I was, I think, one of 4 women members of staff. So everybody else in my life was either a teenage boy or a gentleman of a certain age, which is why I write so much about teenage boys and gentlemen of a certain age, because for all that time, that was my small community, and I realized that actually being a woman in that environment was not what you would call straightforward. I mean, even basic things like toilets, there weren't any women's toilets. There was a disabled toilet, which was always locked, and I had to run down my 1,000 steps to the office and get the secretary to give me the key to the disabled toilet, then run back up again, go to the toilet, and then take the key back again. So there was a whole thing going on here about the kind of passive resistance to women generally. And I knew a lot of people like Straightley, and some of them were appealing, as Straightley is, and some of them were much less appealing. And there was a lot of general bullying going on. And so I gave some of those experiences to Buckfast, who ends up starting her teaching career in a place very like St Oswald's, very like the old Leeds Grammar School. And so I've given her a number of my own experiences.
Which, I mean, the novel has this great subtitle, you say, men walk in through the main gates, women have to improvise. Yeah.
That's
so
right.
I get, do you feel some of those frustrations when you, that Buckfast has?
Oh,
you know,
yes,
some acts
absolutely.
of rebellion that she does, you know, she's told she can't wear a trouser suit, so she comes to work the next day dressed in a bright red miniskirt, which I think
Yes,
is
I
great.
did that.
Did you?
That was one of the stories that I gave her. I thought,
I'm
yes,
glad
because
that's one of the stories.
many of those small, harmless things are things that happened in real life, and you know, this was the 90s, and turning up in a trouser suit was not unheard of in those days, but at Leeds Grammar School it jolly well was. And the third master, who was, for some reason, there were 2 deputy heads, and one was the second master and the other was the third master, because the place had its own language, as they often do. Institutions like to make outsiders feel like outsiders, and so they have a language which you only know if you're an insider, and there's a bit of that in these books too. But yes, he beckoned me into his office and said, "Mrs. Harris, you're wearing pants." And I said, "Yes, well, so are you, third master." He said, no, this is unacceptable. A lady at Leeds Grammar School will wear a skirt or a frock. So I thought, okay, I either cave into this guy or I do something right now, because otherwise I will get bullied forever. So yes, the next day I came up rocked up in a red PVC miniskirt.
How did that go down?
Well, it was interesting, because I thought, you know what, I'm going to have to wear this all day if he doesn't if he doesn't bite. And I thought, you know what, I think he'll probably bite. So I went into his office rather early before any of the boys turned up. And when he picked his jaw up off the ground, I said, as you can see, I've followed the dress code of LGS. But if you felt that the dress code needed revising, I've also brought the trouser suit in a dry cleaning bag. And he looked at me and said, wear the pants. And we never heard anything about it again. So I was able to not have my bluff called there, because...
That's fantastic.
But it was one of the many things that I was made to feel as a young woman in that very patriarchal environment. And sometimes I would just laugh at it because it was hilarious. And sometimes it would make me quite angry. And I think it was that anger that I pulled into Buckfast's character, because Buckfast is not really like me at all, and she doesn't tend to find things hilarious. She tends to find things that she wants to get even for, and so she has an element of resentment, shall we say, against these patriarchal institutions. And one of the things that she's tried to do as head of St. Oswald's is to try and redress the balance, bring girls into this school, bring it kicking and screaming into a new era. But, you know, there's still this class element. It is still a selective school. It's still a school that looks down upon the sunny bankers, who are the ones in the comprehensive across the village, who they never talk to, and they have a kind of on-running feud with. There is still this idea that gender is not the only barrier to entering this small community. There is also money, there is also birth, there is also a level of education. And so, yeah, these books have got quite a bit of that in it too.
Yeah. And the secrets, as you mentioned, is practically everybody's got something to hide, haven't they? And so, and then it's just about the skill. Your skill is wonderful in the way that all that is sort of gradually revealed. Just to, talking about your teaching career, obviously you were still teaching at the time that you wrote Chocolat.
Yeah, I'd written 3 books by the time I left teaching, because, again, full disclosure, writing books isn't generally a proper job, and you don't generally get to make enough money to not have another job that actually pays the bills. And so I thought, okay, I can do this. I can write these books, and also teach and put bread on the table and do both at once. Which is why, I mean, in some ways, people who know me and who knew me then will be able to see where those books came from, and particularly Chocolat. If you think about Chocolat really for a minute, what is it? It's the story of a young woman in a very traditionalist, very patriarchal setting, with one guy who is in charge and who basically tells everybody what to do and makes her feel like an outsider. Wonder where that came from. It's not a million miles away from Buckfast and St. Oswald's either. And this is because I wrote Chocolat in that environment. And I was thinking along those lines already. And some of those old Frenchmen with their berries and their French loaves were kind of pretty much transplanted from LGS and put into this French village, because it wasn't... I wasn't in a situation where I could just go off and do 6 months research in French villages. And so I thought, okay, I'll build my own, and I will use for my inspiration the people around me, which is why some of the characters that I met in my teaching career ended up being mysteriously close to characters that were also there in Chocolat.
That's interesting. Did any of them recognise themselves in
well,
Chocolat?
It's interesting that you should say this, because there was one gentleman called Mr. Fry, who was a physics teacher, and he was very nice. He was a small and modest gentleman, a bachelor, who basically just lived for his teaching, much like Straightley did. And he had a dog called Charlie, and I I took his character and made him. It wasn't really like taking the whole of him. It was like casting him in a role that I knew he would fit. It's much more like amateur dramatics than painting portraits of people. You put somebody in a role where you think, oh, they would fit that role. And so I put Mr. Fry into Chocolat because I'd been told that a book like that wouldn't sell, had no chance of selling. So I thought, well, who's it going to hurt? Mm-hmm. And then when the book came out and was a very surprise bestseller, and then when there was this movie about to come out and 2,000 LGS boys instantly recognized Mr. Fry, I realized that if I had really wanted to keep his identity secret, I should have changed the name of the dog. So if there are any writers out there, always change the name of the dog, because that way you'll have plausible deniability, and I did not have it.
And what was that like? I mean, as you say, it wasn't expected to first of all, why did they think it wouldn't sell? Just because...
Because they never heard of anything like it before.
Yeah.
It wasn't a fashionable genre. In fact, it wasn't even an identifiable genre. They didn't know what it was. They weren't sure whether it was supposed to be literary fiction or commercial fiction or women's fiction, or they just invented this word gastromance, and I thought, what does that mean? So they didn't know how to sell it, and so it wasn't an obvious thing for them to bring out. Yeah. And so no, and my two previous books, which again had been very different from each other, had not had anything more than, shall we say, a cult following, which meant that they were largely unread, except by one woman in Pinner who wrote me several fan letters, which I still have. Oh. But no, it wasn't a given that any of that was going to be successful. You never know with surprise bestsellers, because that's why they're surprise bestsellers.
And what was it like then when it, because it took off massively, and then obviously then there was the film and everything. But that's over 20 years ago now. It must have been completely
all of a sudden the English department
yeah.
hated my guts.
Oh, God.
And also all of a sudden I would get newspapers waiting for me at the exit to the school, and I realized that I was going to have to at least take time out from my job, if not give it up altogether. And so I took a sabbatical, and then I never went back, because all of a sudden I was being asked to do things for the first time, things like touring, things like festivals and signings. I'd never done any of that with my previous books, and I realized that the whole thing was going to expand. And so I went back rather crestfallen to my head of department after having taken my year's sabbatical in the hope of, getting all this book stuff out of my system. And I said, well, you know how I said I was coming back? Well, I'll probably not be able to, sorry. And he just laughed and said, oh, darling, we've given your job to someone else. So I was kind of pushed, but no, there's only a certain level that you can sustain the two things at, and I realized that I'd passed that without even realizing it.
Yes, and it sounds as though was it a difficult decision? I mean, it
was kind of a difficult decision, because I left a very stable job where I knew exactly what was going to happen, to this very unstable job where nobody has the slightest idea what's going to happen next. You're only as good as your last book. Nobody knows whether you're going to be able to sustain a career. There is no pension, there are no proper hours or anything. Remember that my parents are both teachers. My grandfather was a teacher. It was generally assumed when I was a child that I would be a teacher, and I assumed it too. I was sort of expected to. The fact that I actually quite fancied the idea of being a writer just didn't pass muster with my mother particularly. Just said, well, of course you can't be a writer. That's just silly. It's not a proper job. She still feels this way, by the way. she still feels that I made a big mistake. Oh.
And do you miss teaching at all?
Not enough to go back. Right. But certainly enough to write books about it. Because I think that some of these books are written from a place. I mean, they are psychological thrillers and they are dramas in their way, but they're also written from a place of nostalgia. Yeah. Straightley's affection for St. Oswald's is also my affection for the old Leeds Grammar School, for all its faults, for all the fact that, there were mice in the bell tower that came out in the afternoons to try and eat the bits of sandwich that the boys had left lying around, and the fact that I had to run around all the time up and down these ridiculous stone steps, and the fact that even after I'd been at the school for 10 years, occasionally there would still be teachers who mistook me for a secretary or for one of the boys. I got quite fond of the place. It was interesting. It was a bit like teaching in Gormenghast in some ways, because it was just so laden with stories and tradition and dreadful feuds between people that it was a drama waiting to happen. And at some point I was going to crack and actually write it. But I did say from the start that I wasn't going to write about teaching, and I kept that promise for a while. But once I got far enough away from it, and many of my ex-colleagues had died, then I was able to write these books and to enjoy the process.
That's right. Just to go back to Chocolat a little bit, just about the film, which was obviously also a huge success. And I just wondered how much involvement you had in that, or and what kind of an experience it was. And also that thing of having to, is it hard to let go of something that was clearly so
not
important?
Really.
No,
it's not hard to let go, because I wasn't being asked to let go. I mean, the book's still there. If you want to read the book, nobody's changed a word of it. The fact that somebody made a film and the film wasn't quite the same, it was sort of irrelevant to me, because if you don't want somebody to do something that's different to the thing you did, then you don't sell them the rights to do it. As soon as you have done, then any expectation that you have are just unrealistic. It's like giving your favourite tweed jacket to Oxfam and then standing at the door going, no, you can't sell it to him. No, you can't sell it to him, he's too fat. And no, you can't sell it to him either, it's got to be just right. It doesn't work that way. And so the best thing to do is to decide whether you are able to let somebody have free rein over your work or not. If not, fine, you keep the moral high ground. I took the cash. It meant that I was able to give up my job and to have security for just long enough to try out being a writer, to see if it would work for me.
Yeah.
And I'm still trying it out. I still feel as if I'm a teacher on a very long sabbatical sometimes, but I think that's always going to be the case.
Yeah. So that Chocolat was sort of the start. Then you wrote there's another 4 books, I think, is that in the Chocolat series, where you're coming back, revisiting those characters, and you like there's a few series. How do you decide to go back? Because sometimes there's
I don't go back at all.
No,
I've never gone
are
back.
Are they always
anywhere.
there with you? The characters?
Exactly. It's not like they've disappeared. It's not like they're not ongoing characters in my mind. I just don't always write about them because they don't always have a story to tell. But very often I feel as if actually they have contacted me and they've gone, okay, X amount of time has passed, and hey, something's happened. Do you want to hear this story? And so I end up writing the story that there is, but it's not generally planned in the way that you might think it is. It's not that there isn't this kind of godlike view of what will be going on. Very often I'm as surprised by developments as anybody else is, because life is not predictable, and people who are living people as opposed to just flat people on the page, they're not very predictable either. And so I quite like the unpredictability of that, of looking at a character that you knew 10 years ago and going, okay, what are they like now? Has anything changed? And invariably it has, because that's what life does to people. But that's why I don't really think of them as series, because the start of a story is only the start of the story. It's not the start of that person's life generally, or the things that led up to that story. It's just a little slice of narrative set within a certain series of artificial parameters that end up in the book. The rest of it, is anybody's guess, including yours, which is why I left Chocolat an open-ended story. And said, of course, as I always do, and I always lie, that I wasn't going to come back to it, but I kind of did.
I love the idea of your characters kind of getting in touch with you and saying, hello, I'm here.
Yeah, it feels a bit like getting postcards from friends. Particularly with Vian. Vian is a character who has basically grown alongside me, and she isn't me, but we have certain things in common. Particularly what we have in common is motherhood, and a certain relationship with our children. And because I wrote Chocolat as the mother of a 4-year-old, I wrote Vian as the mother of a small child. And then when I wrote about Vian and Anouk again, I wrote about Anouk as an adolescent, because I was by then the mother of an adolescent. And then when I wrote The Strawberry Thief, I wrote as the mother of a child who has left home and who is looking at her own journey and her own adventures and her own relationships. And so, but I had to live through that really to write it, because I wouldn't have been able to do it with any kind of conviction. I wouldn't have felt that I was ready. I wouldn't have known much about it.
Yeah, and I think you've said before that you like to work on sort of several projects at a time. And how? Well, first of all, why do you do that, and how do they kind of feed into each other, or don't they, or is it what's
they
your
don't
approach?
generally feed into each other unless they are related projects, and I don't generally write 2 related projects at the same time, because otherwise you can get confused. What I find is that I tend to write 2 very different things at the same time, so that when inevitably I reach a point in one of my projects where I have to give it some time, either to do research or just to let the story develop, then I can be working on something else while that's happening. It means that I'm just not waiting for something to happen. It's a bit like cooking, really. You cook, you prep something else is cooking, you turn something down, you let it simmer, you're preparing something else. The end result is going to be all produced at the same time, but done at different time intervals. So it kind of feels a bit like that to me. So I'll have one main thing that I'm preparing, and then there'll be another, or sometimes 2 or sometimes 3 other things, little side projects that I'm also working on, which will take a little while to develop, because for me, a lot of the writing time is actually thinking time. It's not time at my desk typing. A lot of it is thinking things, planning things, waiting for them to prove. And sometimes that can take years. I mean, my publishers have done a really good job of pretending that I write a book a year, but it's not really true. Most of those books took several years to write. Some of them took, a decade to write. And the reason you don't get to see that is because there is a kind of rolling program of other things happening during that time.
Right, so I think we've got to the time where we can take a few questions from the floor. Is there a sort of roving mic?
Well, I can just repeat questions if you like, because I'm sure I can hear you.
So does anyone have? So yes. We've got somebody on the front. Yeah. I think there's a mic coming.
Oh, there is an actual mic. Okay.
Thank you for this afternoon. I've loved your books for the last 20 years or so.
Thank you.
Went to France on holiday a lot as a child and in my teens, so it was always, I can read a Joanne Harris set in France. So that was a pleasure. I was just wondering whether what it is about France that's really influenced you. Obviously, you've been a French teacher, but in
I'm
terms
French.
of your... Right,
French was my first language. My mother is
Okay.
French. I've got a French passport. I've got a French family as well as an English family. So a lot of that, again, like writing about schools, a lot of it comes from a place of nostalgia and also a place of knowledge, because I'm the product of these two cultures. And also, I think, because temperamentally, I am more driven to write about stuff that's not right there on my doorstep. I need a certain amount of distance from things to want to write about them, because, if I wanted to write gritty northern realism, then I would have been writing it when I was living in Barnsley, and for some reason that didn't appeal.
Okay.
I'm also a freelancer, so thank you for what you've just said, because that absolutely describes my working life, so thank you very much.
I have every sympathy. I think we're all freelancers, honestly.
Any other questions? There's another one near the front here. Thanks.
Hi, Joanna. Yeah, I think there's lots of freelancers here in the audience. I'm just really interested because obviously The Narrow Door is a lot about memory, and at the moment one of the trends in terms of biography is memoir, and there are lots of publishers running courses on how to write your memoir, etc.
Yes.
And I just wondered whether or not that had actually impinged while you were writing a piece of fiction that is in effect a memoir, that's one of the things that's actually out there as the non-fiction as well. And I found it fascinating, that thing about those memories that are real or maybe not real, or you think they're real but they're not because somebody else has given them to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting point. I've been interested in memory and its function and its persistence and its basic, its elusive nature for quite some time. A few years ago now, I think it might have been 10 years ago, I was the judge of a science prize. Now, I read a lot of popular science books, and there was one particular one that didn't win, but I kind of wanted it to. It was a book by Charles Fernyhough called Pieces of Light, and it kind of blew me away. I don't read an awful lot of non-fiction, or I didn't at the time, and this was a book very much about memory and the brain. And its basic premise, which I thought was at the same time very interesting and also very simple and revolutionary, was the idea that we tend to think of memory as a video camera and our memories as videos that we can revisit at any time. But that's not true, because the brain isn't like that. The brain is a constantly shifting algorithm of little electrical impulses and feelings, and the feelings tend to colour memories. And so every time you recall a memory, it gets coloured by the circumstances in which you recall it, how often you recall it, who you are with when you recall it, whether they say anything which feeds into it. And so by the end of that, you've no idea whether you're remembering the memory or a photograph of the memory or somebody telling you that something happened, or all of those things together. And when you think of that, I mean, I've got a brother who's 10 years younger than me, and my mother tells a lot of stories about me as a child, and I know that they're not about me, they're about him. And he thinks they're about me, but I was there and I remember. And sometimes he and I will talk about things, about relatives, about something that happened, and he will tell a story, and then I will tell the story, and I'll realize how very different our two perspectives were, partly because we were of a different age, but also partly because there's been this cross-pollination from other people's input. And when you think that this happens to all of us on a daily basis, if you then add in the factor of trauma, a memory that has traumatic implications, and when you think how that can be affected by your feelings when you recall it, then you start understanding things like false memory syndrome, and you start understanding how thoroughly unreliable things like witness statements can be, because even when somebody thinks that they're telling the absolute truth, that might not be the case. And I thought, as I read this book, wow, this is going to be interesting. And I've been writing bits and pieces about it ever since, because it just opened up all kinds of storytelling possibilities for me. And so this is why all three of my St. Oswald's books have got elements of this. This is why books like Blue-Eyed Boy have, because this idea of memory and perception just became really important to me.
That's really
It's a long
interesting.
answer for your short question, I do
Very
apologise.
interesting.
Yes.
Yes, up to you.
Hi, thank you for coming out to spend your afternoon with us. I'm Ibrahim Knight, I'm an actor, but I'm trying my hand now at writing because storytelling is what's important to me. So what I wanted to ask you about or get your thoughts on was the difference in the mediums of writing a novel as opposed to something like a screenplay. I find myself gravitating towards writing screenplays, but I think that's because I might be a little bit
Yes.
sort of ADHD and can't sort of lack the discipline to write a longer piece like a novel. But what do you think of that difference? Because you've had a novel, you know, converted into a screenplay, and then you've seen that take a life of its own and a trajectory of its own. why do you choose novels over screenplays? And speaking about Chocolat, what did you know, when it did go and take that life of its own, do you look at that and you still see that as your baby? You know, and what did you think of the overall finished piece of that? And did you meet Johnny Depp?
That's a lot of that's a lot of questions.
Loads of questions. Yeah.
A lot of questions in one. I'll try and remember what they were, but if I forget, just poke me. The easy one first. Yes, I did meet Johnny Depp, but we're not an item or anything. But yes, it's interesting that you should talk about the relationship between screenplays and novels and the idea of discipline, because to me, screenplays are much more rigid discipline than writing a novel. I know it's not as long, but writing screenplays has become extremely formulaic. The simple answer for why don't I write screenplays is basically it's almost impossible to write screenplays and have them picked up unless you're already a writer of screenplays and you have your screenplay commissioned by somebody. And then you kind of get on the circuit of writing screenplays. But also, knowing now more about screenplays than I did 20 years ago, I realized that it's not a life that I could live. Writing screenplays is extremely uncertain. Because I've written screenplays now, I know that you can spend 5 years of your life writing a screenplay which will not see the light of day, and that is going to be most likely your experience. Whereas normally, if I write a novel, I can be pretty sure it's going to be published, and the work that I've put in to writing it is going to actually have something other than just money to show for it, which, I mean, to me is important because I love writing, I love doing what I do, but I also love the fact that I can get to share it with people. The richest writers in the world, barring a few extremely well-known novelists, are all screenplay writers. And the richest screenplay writer in Hollywood is a woman you've never heard of because none of her screenplays have ever been made into films. She has, however, got an enormous pad in Beverly Hills with its own enormous swimming pool. All of that sounds like hell to me, and she is welcome to have it. But that is probably the difference between wanting to write screenplays and wanting to write novels, because a novel is a solo effort. A screenplay is invariably a group effort, and sometimes an effort which doesn't actually lead to anything. And that's really the difference.
And you have, as a novelist, you have way more control, don't you? As you say.
Well, as a novelist with a publisher and a reasonable expectation of being published, I can usually write a novel and then expect 18 months later for it to come out in some form. If my publisher for some reason didn't like it, I could take it to another publisher. I could self-publish it. I would have options. With a screenplay, you don't have any options. Either your screenplay gets made into a movie or it doesn't. You can't then take it to somebody else if the producer you're working with just decided not to go ahead or pull the plug, because they would own it. They would own that work. It wouldn't be yours anymore. In terms of how I felt about my book being made into a screenplay, it seems to me that those things are such different things. I mean, yes, there is something to do with the arcs of narrative which those things have in common, but in terms of the medium, they're so different that I just didn't feel anything at all. I thought, oh, it's great that it's going to be made into a movie. Let's hope they don't set it in space. Or worse, in America, they didn't do either, and so I was really happy that they chose to still set it in France, that they kept most of my characters more or less intact. But if they hadn't done, it would not have been the end of the world for me. Because I don't write a book hoping that it's going to grow up to be a movie. I write a book hoping that it's going to grow up to be the best book I can possibly write, and anything that happens beyond it is just somebody else's business. And if they want to give me money for what they do to it, then all the better. In fact, if there are any producers here who want to do that, are you a producer, sir? No, just somebody asking a question. Gentleman at the back there. But yeah, I mean, that's basically how I see it.
Reminds me of Nye Bevan's quote about Clement Attlee. He was a modest man and much to be modest about. But how did Mr. Fry take to the book?
Oh, well, Mr. Fry was very puzzled about the whole thing. He hadn't read the book initially. And the boys said, Miss has written a book and you're in it, Mr. Fry, and so is Charlie. And by then there was going to be a movie happening and everybody wanted to know who was going to play him and who was going to play the dog. And so eventually I just had to come out and say, you know what, I just did this and I didn't realize it was going to make such a kerfuffle. And so I took him to the one picture house in Leeds that allowed us to take the dog. And we went to see the movie together. And the movie seemed like 6 hours long. I'd seen it a few times before by then. And every time his character appeared on screen, I would hear this kind of little noise. And the dog would whine. And I thought, oh, God, this is just awful. What's going to happen? And finally it finished, and he tottered out into the light. And I said, well, Mr. Fry, what did you think? And he went, Mrs. Harris, they've made me so tall. But yeah, he became quite the celebrity, and took it all with his habitual good humour, his quiet good humour. There's actually on the new site of the new LGS, there's actually a little bust of him in bronze, which I believe one of the boys made. And the top of his head is very shiny because the pupils have got the habit of just basically touching the top of his head for luck. He died quite recently, and he would have been very touched, I think, to see how the whole school came out at lunchtime and without being told to do anything at all, just stood in silence for 20 minutes as his little cortege went past to the funeral, because he was genuinely loved. And I still get ex-boys who are now men running the world in one way or another, talking about him. So it's kind of nice to think that he got that little cameo and that he liked it.
Yeah, that's very sweet.
I'm glad I asked that question, actually. Yeah. Right, the other question that I had up my sleeve was there an element, when you wrote the book, of getting even with Leeds Grammar School? And was there an element of carrying a flag for womanhood?
Well, sort of. It wasn't so much getting even as... I mean, this is, like all my St. Oswald's books, it is a comedy, albeit quite a dark comedy. I had a lot of affection for the place, but it didn't mean that some of the members of staff didn't piss me off royally from time to time, and so there's that element in there too. But there was also I wanted to write, because I don't know why, maybe it's because I've reached a certain age. I wanted to write a story about a woman coming into her power, because I had entered that profession, much as Buckfast entered hers, as a teacher in their 20s, and I had to learn a lot of hard lessons. Coming back to it as a writer definitely not in their 20s, I thought, you know what, I can write about this experience now. I've got enough space to do it in the way that I want to do it, but also to ask some hard questions about patriarchy and what it means, and whether it still exists, and yes, it does, and about women of a certain age coming into their power, because actually that's what this book is about. Rebecca Buckfast is a woman of a certain age, and I quite enjoyed writing her as a lead character, because a lot of the time you read books about women of a certain age, and they're all either finding themselves in Venice, or looking for love,
Yeah, it's like following
or
a marriage
looking
breakup,
wistfully back at their youth. And Buckfast isn't doing any of these things. She's kind of, some of it is about her youth, but she's quite pragmatic about things like that. She's quite happy to have outgrown that woman that she was, and to have come into some real power, instead of just the kind of puny sexual power that you get when you're gorgeous in your 20s, which she's quite, you know, she's quite happy that she's not like that anymore, and that now she's got some real power and intends to use it. So I quite liked doing it from that angle, because that was definitely not my experience.
Yeah. Just halfway down, thanks. I think that'll probably have to be our last question.
Hi, Joanne. It's lovely to meet you. I really enjoy reading your work. I'm just wondering what your sort of inspiration was for sort of the magical, mystical elements of some of your characters, and the use of imagery like the wind, please.
I think all of those things are quite intuitive for me. I don't tend to think them through in the way that you might expect. So I think the thing is, with the magical elements of things, I've always been interested in what people believed and how their belief affects their behavior. And so that includes things like religions, superstitions, folklore, the kind of stories that we tell ourselves as communities to talk about where we came from and who we are, and all those things were interesting. And because I came from two cultures, I had twice as many stories and cultural landmarks, if you like, to feed into. So there was that. So this is a kind of lifetime's research, if you like, into those areas. It's why I write so much about folklore and fairy stories and fantasy, because to me all these things are linked. They're all part of why people behave the way they do, why they believe the things they do, how that affects their behavior. But I never thought it through in that way. I mean, I'm thinking it through now because people sometimes ask me questions about it. But when I write, I don't think those things through. I just think, okay, how do I feel about this? What lens do I want to write the story that I'm telling through? And very often it's a lens of feeling and experience. And I know that there are creative writers among you, I can tell. But you know, when they tell you, write what you know, they don't really mean write what you know. What they mean is, know what you're writing about, which is useful. It means do your research. If you're going to write about something that you don't have enough information about, then go off and do some research. But it also means make it emotionally resonant. Do not write about things that you don't understand from the inside. And that really means feelings. Nobody who hasn't known love will be able to write a really convincing love story. This is the way I feel. And so, in the same way that I didn't write about motherhood until I had a child, because I didn't know what it felt like to have a child. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to do it, and that the story that I was writing would have this absence in its center. So there's that too. But that's the way I do it. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's the way all writers do it, because, as I say in my book about writing, basically there are hundreds of paths to the same ultimate destination, which is a book. And if you take the one that gets you to the book that you wanted to write, then you took the right one.
That's good. I think that's a really positive, wonderful note to end on, actually. So thank you very much, Joanne.
Thank you,
Yvette.